and the exercise of that truth in a pure and chaste life. The Catechism of the Catholic Church goes on to observe, those in charge of education can reasonably be expected to give young people instruction respectful of the truth, the qualities of the heart, and the moral and spiritual dignity of man. For the Christian, this entails education in holiness of life and in the respect owed to the inviolable dignity of self, body and soul, and of others as oneself. Such education must first take place in the family and then be sustained in the institutions which work with parents for the Christian education of their children. The irreplaceable role of education. For the sake of our young people, we must give particular attention to the fundamental expression of our culture, which is education. Good parents and good citizens must be attentive to the curriculum which schools are following and to the life in the schools, in order to assure that our children are being formed in the human and Christian virtues and are not being deformed by indoctrination into confusion and error concerning the most fundamental truths of human life and of the family, which will lead to their slavery to sin and therefore profound unhappiness and to the destruction of culture. Today, for example, we sadly find the need to speak about traditional marriage as if there were another kind of marriage. There is only one kind of marriage, as God has given it to us. There is only one kind of marriage, as God has given it to us at the creation, and as Christ has redeemed it by his saving passion and death. At the heart of a solid curriculum is both respect for the dignity of the human person and for the tradition of beauty, truth, and goodness in the arts and the sciences. So often today, a notion of tolerance of ways of thinking and acting contrary to the moral law seems to be the interpretative key for many Christians. According to this approach, one can no longer distinguish between the beautiful and the ugly, the true and the false, and the good and the evil. The approach is not securely grounded in the moral tradition, yet it tends to dominate our approach to the extent that we end up claiming to be Christian while tolerating ways of thinking and acting which are diametrically opposed to the moral law revealed to us in nature and in the sacred scriptures. The approach at times becomes so relativistic and subjective that we do not even observe the fundamental logical principle of non-contradiction. That is, that a thing cannot both be and not be at the same time in the same respect. In other words, certain actions cannot at the same time be both true to the moral law and not true to it. In fact, charity alone must be the interpretive key of our thoughts and actions. In the context of charity, tolerance means unconditional love of the person who is involved in evil, but firm abhorrence of the evil into which the person has fallen. All education should be directed to forming the students in the charity by which the mind and heart respond to the beautiful, the true, and the good as God has created us to do. Fundamental to the Catholic life of virtue is the understanding of human nature and conscience. At the heart of the deplorable cultural situation in which we find ourselves is the loss of a sense of nature and of conscience. Pope Benedict XVI addressed the question of the loss of a sense of nature and conscience with respect to the foundations of law in his address to the Bundestag during his pastoral visit to Germany in September of 2011. Taking leave from the story of the young King Solomon, on his accession to the throne, he recalled to political leaders the teaching of the Holy Scriptures regarding the work of politics. God asked King Solomon what requests he wished to make as he began to rule God's holy people. The Holy Father commented, "What will the young ruler ask for at this important moment? Success, wealth, long life, destruction of his enemies?" He chooses none of these things. Instead, he asks for a listening heart, so that he may govern God's people and discern between good and evil. The story of King Solomon, as Pope Benedict XVI observed, teaches what must be the end of political activity and therefore of government. He declared, "Politics must be striving for justice, and hence it has to establish the fundamental preconditions for peace. To serve right and to fight against the dominion of wrong is and remains the fundamental task of the politician." Pope Benedict XVI then asked how we know the good and right, which the political order and specifically the law are to safeguard and promote. While he acknowledged that in many matters, the support of the majority can serve as a sufficient criterion, he observed that such a principle is not sufficient for the fundamental issues of law in which the dignity of man and of humanity is at stake. Regarding the very foundations of the life of society, positive civil law must respect nature and reason as the true sources of law. In other words, one must have recourse to the natural moral law which God has inscribed upon every human heart. Referring to a text of St. Paul's letter to the Romans regarding the natural moral law and its primary witness, conscience, Pope Benedict XVI declared, "Here we see the two fundamental concepts of nature and conscience, where conscience is nothing other than Solomon's listening heart, reason that is open to the language of being." Further illustrating the sources of law in nature and reason, by making reference to the popular interest in ecology as a means of respecting nature, he observed, "Yet I would like to underline a point that seems to me to be neglected today as in the past. There is also an ecology of man. Man too has a nature that he must respect and that he cannot manipulate at will. Man is not merely self-creating freedom. Man does not create himself. He is intellect and will, but he is also nature, and his will is rightly ordered if he respects nature, listens to it, and accepts himself for who he is, as one who did not create himself. In this way, and in no other, is true human freedom fulfilled." Reflecting upon European culture, which developed from the encounter between Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome, from Israel's faith in God, the philosophical reason of the Greeks, and Roman legal thought, he concluded, "In the awareness of man's responsibility before God, and in the acknowledgement of the inviolable dignity of every single human person, European culture has established criteria of law. It is these criteria that we are called to defend at this moment in our history." While Pope Benedict XVI's reflection is inspired by a concern for the state of law in the European culture, his conclusions regarding the foundations of law and therefore of order in society are clearly universal in application. What Pope Benedict XVI observed regarding the foundations of law and the concepts of nature and conscience points to the fundamental work of education, namely to develop in students the listening heart which strives to know the law of God and to respect it by development in the life of the virtues. The arts and sciences are most fully taught to students within the context of the divine order which they ponder and express. As Christians, we must help society to recognize a certain order which permits the individual to pursue his own good while at the same time respecting the good of others who form a community with him. The good is defined by the order found in the nature of persons and things, by which the same persons and things are directed to objective ends. In truth, the individual must understand that his own good cannot be served while the good of others and the order of creation are violated. The individual cannot achieve his proper end, and therefore happiness, apart from respect for the proper end and ultimate happiness of his neighbor, and for the proper end of the things with which he interacts. Life in common is otherwise reduced to the tyranny of whatever group is able to prevail by winning the support of a majority. Without the recognition of the common good, to which the individual good is essentially related and which it serves, society breaks down and is soon beset by the violence and destruction which are the inevitable fruits of unbridled individualism and self-pursuit. The fulfillment to which the common good is directed is not a self-defined condition, but rather the perfection of the individual or group according to man's proper nature and end. The objectivity of the common good, as it is discovered by right reason in the natural order, determines the good order of a nation. Children and young people must be educated to safeguard the common good which rests on the reality of the nature and end of the persons and of the things with whom or with which they relate. It is essential that citizens be educated in the virtues which help them to understand the common good and to obey the law which safeguards it. In his encyclical letter Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict XVI takes up the question of the common good, which in his words is sought not for its own sake, but for the people who belong to the social community and who can only really and effectively pursue their good within it. Dedication to the common good, as Pope Benedict XVI makes clear, is an obligation imposed by both justice and charity. He concludes, the more we strive to secure a common good corresponding to the real needs of our neighbors, the more effectively we love them. Essentially connected with the discussion of the natural moral law is the correct understanding of conscience. It is the conscience, the voice of God speaking to souls, which is, in the words of Blessed John Henry Cardinal Newman, the aboriginal vicar of Christ. As such, the conscience is ever attuned to Christ himself, who instructs and informs it through his vicar, the Roman Pontiff, and the bishops in communion with the Roman Pontiff. Blessed Cardinal Newman observed that conscience is a messenger of him who, both in nature and in grace, speaks to us behind a veil and teaches and rules us by his representatives. Today, one must be attentive to a false notion of conscience, which would actually use the conscience to justify gravely sinful acts. In his 2010 Christmas address to the Roman Curia, Pope Benedict XVI reflected at some length on the notion of conscience in the writings of Blessed John Henry Cardinal Newman, contrasting it with a false notion of conscience which is pervasive in our time. He described the Church's understanding of conscience as faithfully and brilliantly taught by Blessed Cardinal Newman with these words. In modern thinking, the word conscience signifies that for moral and religious questions, it is the subjective dimension, the individual, that constitutes the final authority for decision. The world is divided into the realms of the objective and the subjective. To the objective realm belong things that can be calculated and verified by experiment. Religion and morals fall outside the scope of these methods and are therefore considered to lie within the subjective realm. Here it is said, there are in the final analysis no objective criteria. The ultimate instance that can decide here is therefore the subject alone. And precisely this is what the word conscience expresses. In this realm, only the individual with his intuitions and experiences can decide. Newman's understanding of conscience is diametrically opposed to this. For him, conscience means man's capacity for truth, the capacity to recognize precisely in the decision-making areas of his life, religion and morals, a truth, the truth. At the same time, conscience, man's capacity to recognize truth, thereby imposes on him the obligation to set out along the path towards truth, to seek it and to submit to it wherever he finds it. Conscience is both capacity for truth and obedience to the truth, which manifests itself to anyone who seeks it with an open heart. Conscience, therefore, does not set individuals apart from one another as arbiters of what is right and good, but unites them in the pursuit of the one truth, ultimately our Lord Jesus Christ, who is the only arbiter of the right and the good, so that their thoughts, words, and actions put that truth into practice. Later in the same Christmas address, Pope Benedict XVI recalled his encounter with the world of culture in Westminster Hall during his pastoral visit to the United Kingdom, during which he reflected on the proper place of religious belief within the political process. Taking inspiration from the example of St. Thomas More, he addressed directly the ethical foundations of civil discourse. As a service to culture in general, he set forth the Catholic understanding of the matter with these words. The central question at issue then is this: where is the ethical foundation for political choices to be found? The Catholic tradition maintains that the objective norms governing right action are accessible to reason, prescinding from the content of revelation. According to this understanding, the role of religion in political debate is not so much to supply these norms as if they could not be known by non-believers, still less to propose concrete political solutions which would lie altogether outside the competence of religion, but rather to help purify and shed light upon the application of reason to the discovery of objective moral principles. Pope Benedict XVI noted that the role of religion in public discourse is not always welcomed, for various reasons, which can also include distorted forms of religion, such as sectarianism and fundamentalism. He observed, however, that such distortions do not justify the exclusion of religion from public discourse, for reason too can fall prey to distortions, as when it is manipulated by ideology or applied in a partial way that fails to take account of the dignity of the human person. What remains necessary and true is the right relationship of faith and reason. He concluded, this is why I would suggest that the world of reason and the world of faith The world of secular rationality and the world of religious belief need one another and should not be afraid to enter into a profound and ongoing dialogue for the good of our civilization. Pope Benedict XVI concluded with an invitation to safeguard and foster the right relationship of faith and reason, which is essential to the pursuit of the common good, of society. In his 2010 Christmas address, he issued the same invitation with even greater urgency, declaring, "This fundamental moral consensus derived from the Christian heritage is at risk wherever its place, the place of moral reasoning, is taken by the purely instrumental rationality of which I spoke earlier. In reality, this makes reason blind to what is essential. To resist this eclipse of reason and to preserve its capacity for seeing the essential, for seeing God and man, for seeing what is good and what is true, is the common interest that must unite all people of goodwill. The very future of the world is at stake." There can be no question of the urgency with which Pope Benedict XVI was calling Catholics and all persons of goodwill, in accord with the new evangelization so steadily advanced by Pope John Paul II, to reverse the decline of Western Christian culture by engaging public discourse with the fundamental truths of the moral law as taught to us by reason and illumined by the Catholic faith. To conclude, education which takes place first in the home and is enriched and supplemented by truly Catholic schools is directed fundamentally to the formation of good citizens and good members of the Church. Ultimately, it is directed to the happiness of the individual, which is found in right relationships and has its fulfillment in eternal life. It presupposes the objective nature of things to which the human heart is directed, if it is trained to be a listening heart. It seeks an ever deeper knowledge and love of the true, the good, and the beautiful. It forms the individual to this fundamental pursuit throughout his or her lifetime. In proposing these reflections tonight, I have wanted to honor what I know to be the truly Catholic education imparted at St. John Paul II Preparatory School. At the same time, I have wanted to encourage profoundly all who are committed to the educational mission of the school, and thus to the transformation of our culture. May God inspire and strengthen all who are part of St. John Paul II Preparatory School in the work of forming listening hearts in the students who are the hope of our future. Thank you for your kind attention. God bless all of you, and God bless your homes.